I find it quite exciting to be able to interact with these famous and profound thinkers with the quest of saying, how can I make this understandable to me? And if I get it, then anybody can get it.
You know, more than 200 times every second around the clock, someone is asking an online search engine about God. Sometimes with, is God real? Does God exist? Google, for example, answers that query with 3.7 billion results in 2/3 of a second. But I think we need a little better answer, and certainly we have our atheist friends saying there is no evidence for God. There is no evidence that there's life after death. There is no evidence that we have an objective standard for right and wrong. But if you've been listening to this program any length of time, you know that we believe that there is very good evidence, and we are dedicated to presenting that. And that's why I'm excited about this new book. It is just out. You probably will be able to find it in your local bookstore in the next day or two, but if not, we certainly have information about it on the website. It is entitled, Is God Real? Exploring the Ultimate Question of Life. It's written by our good friend Lee Strobel, of course, a former award-winning legal editor with the Chicago Tribune, also a New York Times best-selling author, more than 40 books and curriculum, about 14 million copies in print. And, of course, more recently, we've talked about the fact that he was the founding director of the Lee Strobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics at Colorado Christian University near Denver, has his degrees from the University of Missouri and Yale Law School. And Lee Strobel, it is always great to have you on the program.
Well, Kerby, it's always great to talk with you. I wish we'd talk more often. You know, I do it every time I have a book come out, but I sure enjoy chatting with you.
Well, we'll see if we can increase the frequency. But anybody that is not familiar with your books, this one is in the theme of so many others, A Case for Christ, A Case for Faith, and others. And that is a 250-page book published by Zondervan, who's been your publisher all these years, right, in which you then, in this particular case, have 6 chapters where you spend some time setting forth the case and doing interviews with people we've had on this program, William Lane Craig, Stephen Meyer, Doug Groteis, Chad Meister, and then 2 final chapters on challenges about suffering and the hiddenness of God. And again, we benefit from your expertise, but as you've always done in many of your books in the past, take us to an expert who can share some really great insight about how that particular area of their expertise once again reemphasizes and confirms the existence of God.
Yeah, I see my role as kind of a conduit between the academic world, the scholarly world, and the everyday world, because I'm a journalist, and so I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, but I'm comfortable with going to these world-class experts with PhDs from Cambridge and all these prestigious universities and interviewing them and asking the tough questions I had when I was a skeptic, when I was an atheist, and kind of, as somebody once said, put the cookies on the bottom shelf. In other words, to then produce something that the average person like myself can understand some of these lofty academic answers that these scholars give. So I find it quite exciting to be able to interact with these famous and profound thinkers with the quest of saying, how can I make this understandable to me? And if I get it, then anybody can get it.
Well, again, one of the things I love about this is, of course, you have this inquiring mind. You're a great interviewer. But even before we get into some of the key chapters, I might mention that you put a section in there, not only talking about how you were a skeptic that came to belief, but you tell the brief story of a number of people we've interviewed on this program, like J. Warner Wallace and Michael Brown and a number of others. If nothing else, if you were to hand this to an individual saying, okay, well, yeah, I'm glad that you eventually decided to become a Christian, but are you an exception? And you actually point out, no, there are a lot of other people that have traveled down the same road that you've traveled down.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that because those, I kind of bullet point the brief stories in the introduction to the book, and these are only people I know. So, you know, these are, if I were to look at the wide range of skeptics and atheists and agnostics who've come to faith in Christ, largely because they examine the evidence, you'd have an even bigger universe to draw from. But these are folks who just are in my sphere of influence, and there's so many of them, as you say, who have found that as they have investigated the evidence, as they've sincerely pursued the case for Christ, they've found that it's it's substantial and makes sense and it's persuasive.
Well, we can get through this. And again, for people that maybe want to follow along, sometimes I'd like to take some notes, number 1 to 8, but we're going to look at the first 6 as we go through this. And the first is the cosmos requires a creator. Now, that goes all the way back to Aristotle and the idea of cause and effect. But you remind us of the fact that if indeed we are talking about this huge thing called the universe, the cause has to be, first of all, outside of the universe, outside of space and time, has to be more powerful. But in the midst of this, then you take us to an interview you did with an individual that I've known for many years, oftentimes have moderated some of his debates, had him on the program, and that is Dr. William Lane Craig.
Right, exactly. And as Dr. Craig points out, this idea that the universe had a beginning and therefore needed a creator has been traced back. This argument that he uses, called the Kalam cosmological argument, actually is traced back to Islamic theology in the medieval times. And now we know, because of scientific discoveries over the last 50 years or so, about the expansion of the universe, that our universe did have a beginning. For centuries, scientists believed the universe was static. It was eternal. And now we know, no, it wasn't. It had a beginning. And so this leads to the argument that whatever begins to exist as a cause, we now know that the universe began to exist at some point in the past. Therefore, the universe must have a cause behind it. And then, as you say, you look at what kind of a cause can bring a universe into existence. Must be transcendent because it exists apart from creation. Must be immaterial or spirit because it existed before the physical world. Must be timeless or eternal because it existed before physical time was created. Must be powerful given the immensity of the creation event. Must be smart given the precision of the creation event. Must be personal because he had to make the decision to create. Must be creative because look at the beauty of the universe. Must be caring or loving because he so purposefully crafted a habitat where we can flourish in. And then the scientific principle of Occam's razor would say that there would be just one creator. So you look at that and you go, wait a second. Transcendent, spirit, eternal, powerful, smart, personal, creative, caring, loving, unique. That's a description of the God of the Bible.
So well done. I might just mention that one of the things I get to do once a year is to teach on creation at a Bible school. And there's a section in which I kind of take people through kind of how you talked about this, because in Romans 1, it talks about the fact that they are without excuse. In other words, there is evidence of the Creator in the creation. And I said, just working from what we know from science, you could come to the conclusion that this cause had to be eternal, it had to be outside of time, it had to be omnipotent. It certainly had to be also omnipresent. It also had to be certainly understanding some of those very fundamental issues. So it had to be intelligent, had to be creative. And I make the case that certainly the argument made sense in the first century when the Apostle Paul in Romans 1 talks about the evidence of Creator in the creation. But we now know even more from our scientific endeavors that makes some sense. And we're going to look at 2 chapters, all having to do with design. First, we're going to look, as we look in our telescope at the heavens, do we see and actually observe design in the universe? And then we'll look again in the microscopes at the small dimensions of life and see if we have design in the small dimensions in biology. But Lee, certainly one of the very important verses that relate to this idea of a universe that has a fine tuning is the fact that Psalm 19 says the skies declare the work of his hands, or the heaven declare the glory of God. And there's, I think, a real important principle here that we've always sort of thought there was a design in nature, but as you do an interview with Dr. Michael Strauss, we are seeing more and more evidence of the fine tuning of the universe in ways that we would not have imagined until astronomers began to look for those.
That's exactly right. I mean, one of the striking discoveries that scientists have made in the last 50 years or so is that the numbers that govern the operation of the universe, in other words, physics, these numbers unexpectedly conspire in an extraordinary way to make the universe habitable for life. In other words, as you say, the universe is finely tuned on a razor's edge so that life can exist. It's like if you I'm right now. I'm in Colorado, and if you go up to the mountains in the summer in Colorado, and you look up at the sky and you see all the thousands of stars. But what if you looked up at the sky one night, and instead of seeing thousands of stars, you saw 50 to 100 giant dials in the sky? And each one of these dials could be calibrated to one of trillions and trillions of possible settings. And yet every one of these dials is absolutely perfectly calibrated so that life can exist. That is the picture that modern physics gives us of our universe. And it defies the explanation that, this could have happened by chance. I talked to a famous physicist about this, and I said, given how finely tuned it is, could this have happened by chance? He said, we scientists have a term that we use for that likelihood. I said, what is it? He said, ain't going to happen. And so you look at these, and one dial would be the representative of gravity, the force of gravity. We know all what force of gravity is. You drop something, it's going to hit the ground. And yet, force of gravity, the value of it is set at the exact right place so that life can exist. How exact is it? Well, if you took a ruler across the entire known universe, 15 billion light years, this ruler, broken down in 1-inch increments, that represents the plausible range along which the force of gravity could have been calibrated. And yet it's set at the exact right place so that life can exist. What if we change it? What if we change it by 1 inch compared to the 15 billion light-year width of the universe? All of a sudden, intelligent life becomes impossible anywhere in the universe. And that's just one example.
In my book, A Biblical Point of View on Intelligent Design, we give you some of those numbers, but you use the same numbers because at one point they're talking about looking at all of these parameters together, because some people say, well, maybe we just hit the cosmic lottery, we just got lucky. And we're talking about 10 to the minus 304th power, and it would take me a better part of another minute to talk about the million, trillion, and it just goes on and on and on for that. And at that point, you can say, no, we're not talking about improbable. We're talking about impossible.
Exactly.
And those are, I think, very helpful because even in your book, you talk about this. And the next person we're going to talk about is an individual we've had on this program before, Dr. Stephen Meyer, in his book dealing with the return of the God hypothesis. They point out that because these numbers are so big and because they are so improbable, people are coming up with alternative theories, which you address as well, for example, the multi-universe theory and things like that, without any observational evidence, but it shows the level of desperation you have to go to in order to be an atheist these days.
Yeah, in fact, just recently, there's a German theoretical physicist, quite prominent, named Sabine Hossenfelder. And she's one of the most prominent German physicists that there is. She's an agnostic, by the way. She doesn't believe yet that God exists. But she said this idea that there's an infinite number of invisible universes that we have no evidence of, and if you spin the dials in all those universes, certainly it come up positive in one of them, and that's us. We won the cosmic lottery. She said her words were, that is a waste of time. That's her words from a scientific perspective. She said that idea that there's an infinite number of universes for which we have no physical evidence whatsoever, she said that's popular among the media, but true scientists, very few of them buy into it. I like what Richard Swinburne said. He's the former philosopher at Oxford University. He said, to postulate a trillion other universes rather than one God in order to explain the orderliness of our universe seems to be the height of irrationality. If one universe requires an explanation, then an infinite number of universes requires an even bigger explanation, and that points even more powerfully toward a creator.
So well said. Again, that's just chapter 2. So let's talk about chapter 3, because now as we look at our microscopes, we have so much evidence now because we recognize that there is code in the DNA, which is as complex as, actually more complex than anything a computer programmer would write. And Dr. Stephen Meyer has written about that in The Signature of the Cell, and of course the book I just mentioned a minute ago, The Return of the God Hypothesis. But if you think the arguments from the universe are powerful, the ones as we look into the cell are even more powerful, aren't they?
I agree. I mean, when you look, we have 100 trillion cells in our body. If you were to open just one cell and unwind the DNA, the strand of DNA, it would be 6 feet tall. And embedded in that DNA is a 4-letter chemical alphabet that spells out the precise assembly instructions for every protein out of which our bodies are made. So that means inside every cell in your body is more information, more words than you would find in 200 years of the Sunday New York Times. Where does that come? Where does information come from? Nature can't produce information. It can produce patterns. I mean, the famous example is if you're walking down the beach at dawn and in the wet sand you see ripple marks, you would say, oh, nature can do that. The waves created that pattern, those ripples in the sand. But if you're walking down the beach and in the sand you see John loves Mary with a heart around it and an arrow through it, you wouldn't say, oh, the waves made that. Because whenever you see information, whether it's a computer code, whether it's a book, whether it's a painting on a cave wall, whenever you see information, without exception, there's always an intelligence behind it.
Let me just say again that this book is just out, and there's a whole section where there's a guide for reflection and group discussion, because I know, Lee, you have such a heart for evangelism. This is not only a book that I could hand to my non-Christian friends that maybe are at least seeking, but It's also a wonderful way you've already created in the book to have kind of a small group Bible study, an evangelistic Bible study, and as people begin to work through the first 6 chapters, and then obviously they'll raise some questions in some of the other chapters having to do with the challenges to Christianity, you can really have a great discussion with some of your unsaved friends, neighbors, coworkers, even family members.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I designed that as a way to reach out to people and have a discussion. You could do it just with believers as a way to deepen their faith and equip them to share Jesus with others more confidently. But I love the idea. Let's get together some friends who are maybe spiritually curious. They don't know what they believe. And you can go through the book together. You can go through the discussion questions. And my prayer is that people realize not only God is real, but he is the God of Christianity, and we can know him personally for eternity if we receive this free gift of grace through Jesus Christ.
There's some great material that certainly you could use in an evangelistic study or something that would reaffirm your faith. We've looked at some of the scientific arguments. Let's look at some of the more historical and theological issues. Easter showed that Jesus is God. Now, first of all, I'd have to say, Lee, you could interview yourself because you have become quite a scholar on that. Or you could have interviewed Gary Habermas. I remember that interview you did with him, I think going all the way back to the Case for Christ.
Right.
But one of the other real experts is Michael Licona. Of course, I know you have crossed paths with him when you were at Houston Baptist University, but the argument for the resurrection is a very significant argument, and it's well attested by history.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was an atheist and my wife became a Christian, I figured, how do I get her out of this cult that she's gotten involved in? I figured I could do that if I could use my journalism training and legal training and disprove the resurrection of Jesus. Because even I, as an atheist, recognize that is the linchpin of the Christian faith. Apostle Paul said, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You're still in your sins. It's the ball game. Why? Because Jesus made transcendent and messianic and divine claims about himself. He claimed to be the Son of God. At one point, he got up before a group and he said, I and the Father are one. And the Greek word for one there is not masculine, it's neuter, which means Jesus was not saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in nature. We're one in essence. And the audience got it, what he was saying. They picked up stones to kill him because they said, you're just a man, and you're claiming to be God. So Jesus claimed to be God, but so what? I could claim to be God. You, Kerby, could claim to be God. Anybody could claim to be God. But if Jesus claimed to be God, died, and then 3 days later rose from the dead, that's a pretty good indication he's telling the truth. And so the resurrection, as you say, is the key. And I like to use 4 words that begin with the letter E to kind of summarize the evidence for the resurrection. I can do it quite quickly. Obviously, the book goes into more detail. Mm-hmm. But, the first E is for execution, that Jesus was truly dead. And no less of a source than the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a secular, scientific, peer-reviewed medical journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus. And their conclusion was clearly the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. I mean, even the atheist scholar, Gerd Ludemann, will say it's indisputable that Jesus was dead after being crucified. Second E stands for early accounts. We have a report of the resurrection of Jesus in the form of a creed of the early church that has been dated back by scholars to within months of his death. And this creed mentions these, it contains the essence of Christianity. It says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. On the third day, he rose from the dead. And then it mentions the specific names of eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses to whom he appeared, including skeptics, including 500 people at once. That dates back to within months of his death, too early to be a legend that developed over 100 years after his life. 30 is for empty tomb. And the strongest evidence there that the tomb was empty is that even the opponents of Jesus implicitly admitted the tomb was empty. Because when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the opponents said was, the disciples stole the body. Well, they're conceding the tomb's empty. They're trying to explain how it got empty. So everybody's conceding the tomb was empty. And the issue is, how did it get empty? The Romans weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus dead. The Jewish leaders of the day weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus to stay dead. The disciples weren't about to steal the body. They didn't have the motive, the means, or the opportunity. And I found 7 ancient sources, 6 of them outside the Bible, that confirm that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen. Why would they do that? Because they knew it was true. And that leads to the 4th E, which is eyewitnesses. Most of what we accept as being true about the ancient world is based on one source of information, or maybe 2 sources of information. If we're really lucky, maybe we have 3 sources of information. And yet, for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Jesus. I mean, that is an avalanche of historical data.
I love how you end it, too, with N.T. Wright, who's been on the program with us before. It is no good falling back on science as having disproved the possibility of the resurrection. Any real scientist will tell you that science observes what normally happens. The Christian case is precisely that what happened to Jesus is not what normally happens. And again, we recognize it's a miracle. And I might point to, again, some of your other works, one in particular on that whole idea of the case for miracles, but you go into more detail. Yeah. But it's the linchpin, and you could stop there. But given the fact that you've given us a few other chapters, let's talk about this idea of experiencing God. Yeah. And I thought that was really interesting because one of my former colleagues, Doug Groteis, we used to be on probe staff together, is an individual that you have interviewed, and I will interview again a little bit later. And you first interviewed him when his wife, Rebecca, who I knew, was dying of a brain condition. Right. And in some respects, you used that interview that you used on the whole idea of the case for an afterlife, and that to also help people understand that there is a whole idea of experiencing God. And I thought that was a really helpful chapter, not one that people might normally have expected in a book on apologetics.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this, and I tell some stories in there about people who I've personally known who have had profound experiences of God that led them to faith. For instance, you remember Nabil Qureshi, the Muslim medical doctor who, because he was challenged by a Christian, began to investigate the evidence for the faith. But he had a supernatural dream, an experience of God in a dream in which this dream was a reflection of a passage of Scripture that he had never read. And that was this dream was one of the steps that led him into his faith in Christ. And then my friend Evel Knievel, the famous motorcycle daredevil rider, who lived a sinful life. My goodness, he was a womanizer. He was a drunk. He was a gambler. He once beat up a guy with a baseball bat and went to prison. I mean, this guy was a bad dude, and he's standing on the beach in his later years, and God spoke to him. He said, I didn't hear it with my ears. I felt it on the inside. And the voice said, Robert, I've saved you more times than you'll ever know. Now you need to come to me through my son, Jesus. And he was flabbergasted. So he called the only Christian he knew, Frank Gifford, the former sportscaster, and said, Frank, you're a Christian. I had this experience. I didn't know who God is and Jesus is. And Frank said, well, get the book Case for Christ. That'll kind of explain it all for you. So he got my book. He read, and Evel Knievel was one of the most radically born-again people I ever encountered. Wow. 180-degree turn in his life. He became on fire for Jesus Christ when he was baptized. He shared his story with such power and such childlike honesty and sincerity that at the end of that, the pastor ripped up his sermon and said, y'all have heard the gospel. If anybody wants to come up right now and receive Jesus and be baptized on the spot, go ahead and do it. This is a church that never had an altar call. And 700 people came forward in 2 services and were baptized on the spot. And when Evil died about a year later, at his request on his tombstone, it says, believe in Jesus Christ. Now, I didn't have that experience. Evil Knievel had that experience. But, even so, I find that encouraging in my spiritual life, that there are these people who have had these profound experiences, often with external corroboration, like the dreams that many Muslims are having in closed countries in the Middle East where the gospel cannot be shared, and yet they're having dreams of Jesus. And in these dreams, Jesus points them towards someone who will explain the gospel to them, and they wake up, and then they later encounter that other person from the dream who shares the gospel with them. That's an external corroboration of an internal experience that they had. I'm fascinated by this whole thing.
Let me again mention that you could also go to the books, The Case for Heaven and The Case for Miracles, even The Case for Hope, and find some of that. You might at this point say, okay, you've made the case for the idea that there's a supernatural, maybe there's a God, but how do we know that there's really one God? And in a sense, which God is real? And that is an interview you did with Chad Meister. He's been on the program with us because there is always the idea that, okay, I believe in a God, I believe in theism, but what about that? There are different views of God and how to think that through. And Lee, I thought, again, a lot of people might say, okay, you've made the case for the fact that there's a God or there are gods, but which God is real? And that's important because in the conversation you have with Chad Meister, you talk about the fact that there's really a clash of 3 isms, atheism, theism, and pantheism, and then do a test to show that atheism and pantheism don't really answer that question. But this is one I know you and I have all run into over the years. People say, well, you've made a good argument for the existence of God, but which God? And so how do we answer that?
I think there's a 2-part answer. I think first part is to say the resurrection is what points us to Jesus being the unique Son of God, and therefore Christianity being true. And then what Chad does, and by the way, Chad, I don't know if you know this, Kerby, but back when I was a pastor in Chicago, and Mark Middleberg and I were heading the evangelism ministry there, Chad was a volunteer for us.
Wow.
And this is before he even got his master's degree. And now, of course, he's a world-famous philosopher with a Ph.D. and just written numerous books. Anyway, what he does is fascinating. He walks me through what he calls the apologetics pyramid, which if you picture a pyramid, it's just the idea you start at the broadest question, and then you taper it as it gets more specific. So you start the broad question of what is truth, and we go through that, and truth, of course, is that which corresponds to reality. And then, as you say, the next level is worldviews. There's only 3 possible worldviews: pantheism, everything is God; atheism, there is no God; or theism, there is a God. And the test that we use to try to determine which is correct is a test of livability and the test of logic. So, in other words, if one of these worldviews is internally illogical, if it contradicts itself, then it can't be true. And if it's not livable, like, for instance, atheism, which says that there is no absolute foundation of right and wrong, well, we can't really live that way. If you really believe that wrong is and right are just whatever we decide is we're going to accept as being right or wrong, independent of any absolute foundation. So we go through those and determine that theism is the only survivor there. Then we analyze theism and why it makes sense, and then we look at the revelation, at Scripture, and to say that God has given us revelation of nature, as we talked about earlier, but also the Bible, and we compare that to the Quran. And if the Bible is true, the Quran is therefore false because they contradict each other. So we make the case that the Christian Scriptures are reliable, and then that leads to the resurrection and why the resurrection points toward Jesus being the unique Son of God, and that takes us to the gospel, which is the peak of the pyramid. But I love the way that Chad, with his, he's a former engineer. Mm-hmm. I love engineers because their minds are so logical and so, and he just plows through that evidence in such a profound way that you walk away going, yeah, there is only one logical and livable conclusion, and that is that theism is true, and therefore, because of the resurrection, Christianity is the form of theism that can be trusted.
And again, I just love that pyramid. Level 1 is on truth, level 2 is on worldviews, and then you start testing those, and you get into the other levels, which are theism and the fingerprints of God and revelation, and ultimately, of course, you get to the resurrection and the rest. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you do have 2 chapters on some of the vexing questions. One, if God is real, why is there suffering? And that one, of course, is one that we've covered before and will continue to do so, because it is a very important question, both philosophically and existentially, but it's also, I think, helpful that you put in this one, which I'm starting to see more and more. If God is real, why is he so hidden? Those are in there because you've run into those as well, haven't you?
Absolutely. And Kerby, you're right. This question of the hiddenness of God has become, I think, the number 2 objection raised by non-believers, the first one being suffering, the existence of suffering. And what happened in our culture a couple of years ago, in 2020, John Steingard, who was the well-known Christian singer of a rock band called Hawk Nelson, very famously walked away from his faith because of this problem, he said, with the hiddenness of God. And it's really become, I think, the number 2 objection. And so I interviewed Kenneth Samples, who you know. Kenneth is with Reason to Believe Ministries and teaches on philosophy of religion at various universities. And I thought he did a great job of kind of unpacking that. It's a complicated issue, but it's an important issue. And it's one that not only do non-believers wrestle with, but believers also wrestle with it as well. When I was on my deathbed 11 years ago or so, back in 2000, when was that? 2011, I guess it was. You know, I would love to have had Jesus walk in the room and hold my hand and tell me everything's going to be okay and remind me of all. And you know, he didn't. And you know, so the hiddenness of God is something I think all of us at some point in our life we wonder, where is God? Look at the Psalms that talk about that. And yet I think can provide some good perspective on that.
And you got to love our job. We get to talk to some of the smartest people, and I get to talk to you as well, which I think is one of the smartest people I know. But just before we run out of time, because I want to leave some time for you to talk about how people can use this, because you have this whole section here, first of all, recommended resources, and then a whole guide for reflection and group discussion. I know that you want people to read the book, but I know you'd also like people to use it in some kind of evangelistic outreach.
Exactly. My hope is that people read the book. It'll deepen their faith. It'll encourage them to reach out to others. And then I hope they give the book away. I hope they give it away to a neighbor or a friend or a colleague at work or a family member who's spiritually curious or doubting or whatever, and say, you know, why don't you read this? I've read it, and there's discussion questions. Why don't we kind of talk it through and see what conclusions we can come to? You know, I meet so many people who are saying their son or their grandson or granddaughter or daughter have walked away from the faith. And, you know, I wrote this book, so this is something to give as a Christmas gift or something to them, and just say, hey, you know, I know we think differently right now. We believe different things, but I believe that the Christian faith is rational. It makes sense. We have a rational God. He's formed us as rational people. And I know you're rational. And would you be willing to look at the evidence to convince an atheist like Lee Strobel that God is real?
And again, I just love the way you've put it together. Again, that guide for reflection and group discussion is something that you can begin to use, and it is ready to go. So get the book. Certainly, you can go to his website or our website. You can find it in your bookstore and put it to good use. And I know, Lee, you will be much more encouraged, not only that people will buy the book, but they are going to use this in a way to advance the gospel. So as always, we thank you not only for writing this book, but for writing so many other books over the years, because in many cases, we've had, I think the first time you and I interviewed was on God's outrageous claims.
Oh, my goodness.
That goes before the case for Christ. So when you're an old guy like me, you meet some of these people on their way up. But it has been fun to watch how God has blessed you richly, and it is such a great opportunity for us to spend time with you. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. Great to be with you. As we Texans say, I appreciate you.
Well, let's again just encourage you one more time to find some of the material. It is available on our website at pointofview.net and really points to God's existence and answers many of these very important questions. One of the most asked questions on search engines is God real? Thanks for joining us, and I hope you again have appreciated all that we've talked about today. And don't forget that if you would like more information about what we're talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.